His hands were shaking when he raised them. Not from fear, not from cold, though it was October and the tin walls of the sale barn held the morning chill like a kept secret. His hands shook the way the hands of certain men shake after certain things, a tremor that lives below the surface of everyday life and surfaces, uninvited, in moments of wait. The kind of shake that has a story behind it that no one in the room was going to ask about. His name was Walter Eugene Briggs. He was 51 years old. He had not been back to Harlan County, Nebraska, in 23 years. Not since the morning his father drove him to the bus depot in a truck that needed a new clutch and shook his hand at the curb and said, "Without ceremony, come back when you can." Walter had gone to Vietnam. He had come back to a country that had moved on without him and to a father who had farmed alone until he could not anymore. The farm was gone. It had been gone for 11 years by the time Walter came back, lost to a sequence of events, bad prices, a bad loan, a drought that the county extension office would later classify as the worst in that corner of Nebraska since 1956, that Walter had not been present for and could not have stopped if he had been. What remained, what was on the block this morning, the last Tuesday of October, 1991, at the Harlan County Implement and Land Sale was the equipment, his father's equipment. A 1957 Oliver, 88 row crop tractor that Walter had learned to drive at the age of 9 in a field of summer corn, his father's hand over his on the steering wheel, both of them laughing at nothing in particular on a warm July afternoon that Walter had carried inside him through 2 tours of Southeast Asia, like a photograph in a shirt pocket. The Oliver had opened at $2,800. It had climbed to $6,400 in the way that good iron climbs steadily, seriously, among men who know what they are looking at. Walter Briggs raised both hands and called, $7,200. The laugh came from somewhere near the front. Low, dismissive, the sound of a man who has decided the bidder does not belong. Others followed, not many, but enough to fill the silence that a room like this should have held. Walter did not lower his hands. He did not look for the source of the sound. He stood the way men stand who have been in places where standing still took everything they had, completely, without flinching. The auctioneer, a man named Carl Dempsey who had been calling sales in that county for 17 years, looked at Walter from the podium. Then he looked at the room, and something changed in his face. Not performance, not theater, the specific expression of a man who has just understood something he wishes everyone else in the building understood too. He called the bid. Clearly, with a gravity he did not normally bring to a Tuesday sale. And the room fell silent. Not because Walter won. He had not won yet. The silence came before that. It came because something in the way Carl Dempsey said, that number $7,200, made every man in the building understand, suddenly and without explanation, that they were in the presence of something they were not going to be able to laugh at. Not today. Not this one. Iron ground is for people who remember what it felt like to work land that mattered. If something in this already feels familiar, subscribe and stay with us. Not every story gets told, but here we make sure they do. It was the last Tuesday of October, 1991, the Harlan County Implement and Land Sale, Alma, Nebraska. Outside, the fields had gone the color of old wheat straw, the particular defeated gold of cropland after harvest. When the year has given everything it has, and the cold is moving in from the northwest, and the ground is bracing itself for what comes next. Inside the sale barn, 90-some men, farmers, dealers, the kind of collectors who drive long distances for good iron, had gathered around a line of equipment that told a story no one was saying out loud. Because the equipment on this block did not belong to a retirement. It did not belong to a man who had decided to let the next generation take over. It belonged to a sequence of losses, weather and debt and time and absence that the county already knew about and had no need to discuss. The Oliver 88 row crop tractor was the centerpiece. It had opened at $2,800. It had climbed through $4,000 and $5,000, $500 and $6,400, with the professional efficiency of men who had done this before and knew the value of what they were bidding on. The tractor was in remarkable condition for a machine of its age, 34 years old, original paint on the hood panels still reading true, the wide front axle set for row crop cultivation in the configuration Walter Briggs Sr. had specified when he ordered it from the Oliver dealer in Arapahoe in the spring of 1957. His son was standing near the east wall. Walter Eugene Briggs Jr. had arrived that morning before the staging was complete, before the crowd, before the auctioneer had climbed his podium. He had stood in the equipment yard in the gray pre-dawn and put his hand on the Oliver's hood the way you touch something you thought was lost, slowly, making sure it is real. He had driven 14 hours from a VA hospital in Kansas City, where he had been a patient on and off for the better part of 3 years. He had a Veterans Administration disability check in his pocket for $340, his monthly income, and a cashier's check for $7,200 that he had assembled across 6 months. From a combination of that, disability income, a one-time hardship grant from a veterans service organization in Missouri, and $1,100 borrowed from a man named Clifford Anson, who had served with Walter in the Mekong Delta in 1968, and who had said, when Walter called, to ask, "Tell me where to send it. Don't say another word about it." He raised both hands when the bidding reached $6,400. He called $7,200. And the room laughed. Before we go further, you need to understand who Walter Briggs was, not what had happened to him, who he was. He was born in 1,940 inches, a farmhouse outside Stamford, Nebraska, the second of 3 sons born to Walter Eugene Briggs Sr. and his wife Doris, a quiet woman from a German heritage farming family in Furnace County who could make a meal out of what most people would call nothing, and who believed, with the serene certainty of someone who had never had reason to question it, that the ground under your feet was the realest thing in the world and everything else was weather. Walter had grown up on 320 acres of bottom ground along the Republican River, corn and wheat, a small hog operation, a milk cow his mother kept for reasons that were not entirely economic. His father was not a complicated man, he was thorough. He believed that a field worked right was a kind of argument that you didn't need to make in words, and he taught his sons this by example rather than lecture, which is the only way it can really be taught. Walter had been the one who loved it most. His older brother had left for Omaha at 19 and not looked back. His younger brother had gone into the county road department and built a reasonable life 30 miles from the home place. But Walter had been the one who sat on the fender of the Oliver 88 during planting, handing his father tools, learning the hydraulic system's quirks by feel before he knew the engineering behind them. He had been driving that tractor alone by the summer he turned 9. He had been a natural farmer in the specific, unteachable way, the way that is partly physical intelligence and partly attention and partly a quality of patience that some people arrive in the world with and others spend their whole lives trying to acquire. He read the ground the way his mother read weather. He understood, without anyone explaining it, that farming is mostly listening. He had been drafted in 1966. He was 26 years old. He had finished one full harvest season with his father before his notice came. They had worked that October together in a way that, Walter would say later, neither of them acknowledged might be the last time. His father shook his hand at the bus depot. His mother had already said her piece at the kitchen table before dawn. There were no speeches. That was not who they were. He did 2 tours. He came home in 1969 with a shrapnel wound in his left thigh that had healed imperfectly and a tremor in both hands that the VA doctors attributed to neurological trauma and that Walter attributed to having been in places where stillness was a luxury no one could afford for very long. He tried to farm again. He worked with his father through the early 1970s, and for a time it seemed like the ground might do what people had always said it could do, put a man back together. For a time it did. Then the prices broke in the late 1970s. Then the drought came in 1980. Then the loan that had been structured on assumptions that no longer held. Then his father, at 71, simply did not have the fight left. The farm was sold in a bankruptcy proceeding in 1980. Walter had not been there for it. He had not been in any condition to be there for it. He spent 11 years working his way back. Construction, custodial work, 2 years in a veterans transitional housing program in Kansas City. He was not the kind of man who talked about any of this. He was the kind of man who, when asked how he was doing, said, "Getting there." By 1991, he was getting there. The Oliver 88 deserves its own introduction, because this machine is not incidental to this story. It is, in the most literal sense, what the story is about. The Oliver 88 row crop tractor was produced by the Oliver Corporation in Charles City, Iowa, between 1947 and 1954, with the updated Super 88 variant running through 1958. The machine Walter's father had ordered in the spring of 1957 was one of the final year Super 88 row crop configurations, a tractor built at the peak of Oliver's engineering confidence before the company began the slow decline that would end in its absorption by White Farm Equipment in 1969. The Super 88's six-cylinder gasoline engine produced 50.93 belt horsepower, not the most powerful machine on the market in its year, but not the point. The point was the torque curve, which arrived early and stayed flat across the working RPM range in a way that made the tractor feel, to an experienced operator, like it was thinking alongside you rather than simply responding to throttle. Row crop farmers who knew this machine understood that it would work at the speed the crop demanded, not at the speed the operator was impatient for. The wide front axle on the Briggs machine had been a specific order from Walter Sr. He had paid the premium for adjustable row spacing because he planted his corn at 38 inches rather than the standard 40, a preference he had developed over 2 decades of observing his own ground's drainage patterns and root behavior. That custom spacing was still set on the tractor as it stood on the sale floor. No one had changed it. Walter Jr. had noticed this in the pre-dawn equipment yard. He had stood at the front axle with a tape measure he had brought specifically for this purpose and confirmed that the spacing was exactly as his father had said it, 38 inches. He had stood there for a long time after he confirmed it. He put the tape measure back in his jacket pocket. He did not cry. He had done his crying in the truck on the way up from Kansas City, alone on the highway at 3 in the morning, and he was finished with it now. He was here to bid. The $7,200 in Walter Briggs's cashier's check was not money that had come easily. It was money that had required him to do something that did not come naturally to a man of his generation and his particular formation. It had required him to ask. He had spent the spring and summer of 1991 attempting every avenue that did not require asking. He had applied to the Veterans Administration for a supplemental grant to support agricultural reentry, a program that existed, on paper, for veterans attempting to return to farming. He had been told that the program required the applicant to demonstrate current access to agricultural land. He did not have land. He could not access the program without land. He could not acquire land without money. The circle closed completely on itself, and Walter wrote the word circular in his notebook and moved on. He had contacted the Nebraska Department of Agriculture's Beginning Farmer Assistance Office. He had been patient and thorough in his inquiry, describing his background and his intention to return to farming on leased ground. He had already identified a parcel in Harlan County, whose owner, an elderly man named Gus Pelletier, who had not been able to farm it himself for 4 years, had indicated a willingness to discuss a lease arrangement if Walter could demonstrate access to equipment. He needed the equipment first. That was the door. Everything else was behind it. The Beginning Farmer office had been sympathetic. They had sent him paperwork. The paperwork required collateral. Walter's total assets at the time of application consisted of a 1,979 Ford pickup, a checking account with $847 in it, and a VA disability rating that entitled him to $340 per month and access to VA medical care. This did not constitute collateral in any form the program's risk structure could accommodate. His third avenue had been a veterans service organization in Kansas City, a nonprofit that administered a hardship fund for veterans facing specific documented needs. He had applied in April. He had been awarded $1,800 in June, following a review process that required him to appear before a three-person committee and explain, in detail, what he intended to do with the money and why. He had explained it. The committee had asked him several questions. At the end, they had voted unanimously to approve the maximum award. One of the committee members, a Korean War veteran in his late 60s named Harris Webb, had walked Walter to the door afterward and said, "I had a farm once, grew corn in Platte County," said it quietly. The way men say things they don't expect a response to. Walter had said, "What happened to it?" Harris Webb had said, "Same thing that happened to a lot of them." They shook hands and Walter had walked to his truck and sat there for a while. The remaining $1,100 had come from Clifford Anson. Walter had not wanted to make that call. Clifford had made it easier by not making it a question, he had said, before Walter finished the sentence. "Tell me where to send it." He had mailed a money order the next morning. He had not asked for a repayment schedule. He had not asked when. He had simply trusted, in the way that men trust each other after certain things, that the money would return when it could, and that this was not a transaction. It was a continuation of something that had started in a rice paddy in 1968 and had no proper end. Walter had converted everything to a cashier's check and driven to Nebraska in October. He had not told anyone he was coming. He had not been certain until the morning of the sale that the Oliver would even be on the block. When he arrived and confirmed it in the pre-dawn equipment yard, he sat on the running board of his truck for a while with his hands between his knees. He was not a man given to sentiment, but he understood, sitting there in the dark with the smell of October and machinery around him, that he was not only bidding on a tractor, he was bidding on the version of himself that had existed before everything that had happened. He was trying to buy his way back to the morning he had sat on that fender at 9 years old, handing tools to his father, learning the feel of iron that was doing what it was built to do. You do not explain this to a room full of dealers at a Tuesday sale. You just raise your hands and you say the number. Stop for a moment, because I want to ask you something. Not about Walter, about you. Is there a piece of equipment, a tractor, a truck, a tool, a machine of any kind that you remember with the specific clarity of something that mattered? Not just a machine, the one that was present during the years that formed you, the one your father drove, or your grandfather, or that you drove yourself before life took you somewhere else for a while. Most men who grew up in farm country have one. They don't always talk about it, they don't need to. It lives in the body, not in conversation, in the specific weight of a steering wheel under certain hands, in the sound of an engine at throttle in an open field on a morning when the world was still simple enough to be managed by working it. Walter Briggs knew what that machine was. He had known for 23 years. He had carried it the way you carry the things that cost you something to lose. He was standing in a room full of men who saw a disabled veteran with shaking hands bidding money he probably didn't have on a tractor he had no visible use for. Not one of them knew what they were actually watching. If you grew up on the land, or someone you love did, then this isn't just a channel. These are your stories. And if you want them to keep being told, you can support it with a simple subscribe. It means we keep showing up here every week, telling the stories that still matter. Carl Dempsey called the bid at $7,200 with the quiet authority of a man who has decided something, not about the outcome. He had no authority over that, about the tone, about how this particular bid from this particular man was going to be treated on his floor. There was a counter. A dealer from Grand Island named Toby Neff, who had come for the Oliver and who had assumed until 30 seconds ago that $6,800 would take it, pushed to $7,500. He did it without looking at Walter. He did it the way men bid when they are no longer sure the thing they are bidding on is purely transactional, quickly, almost defensively, as though speed could settle the question of what kind of contest this was. Walter bid $8,000. He did not hesitate. He did not look at the dealer. He raised his right hand, the one that shook less, and he said the number clearly into the barn air, and he put his hand back down. Toby Neff looked at his catalog. He looked at the tractor. He had driven 2 hours for this machine, and he had a customer in Grand Island who wanted a clean 88 row crop and who would pay a fair price for it. And he knew with the practical arithmetic of a man who buys and sells iron for a living, that at $8,000, he was at the edge of what the margin would support. He had not come prepared to go higher. He did not bid. Carl Dempsey looked at the room. He looked at Walter. He said, $8,000. Do I have 8 to 2? The room was quiet. He said, going once at 8,000. He said it with a weight that made it sound less like an auction call and more like a statement of record. Going twice. The silence in that barn was not the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of 90 men arriving at slightly different speeds, at the same understanding. That something had happened here that was not about iron and dollars. That the shaking hands and the borrowed jacket and the number that had seemed presumptuous 5 minutes ago had turned out to be something else entirely. Sold. $8,000. 1,957. Oliver Super. 88. Wide front row crop. Walter Briggs. Carl Dempsey moved immediately to the next item. He did not linger. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. The room already knew. Walter walked to the sale barn office. He signed the paperwork. He paid with the cashier's check and $800 in cash from a fold of bills in his shirt pocket. The $800 over the $7,200 he had planned for was money he had held back as a contingency, not sure until this morning whether he would need it. He would need it. He had used every dollar he had. He arranged to have the Oliver transported to Harlan County on a flatbed, owned by a man he had met that morning, another veteran, as it turned out, who had recognized something in Walter's bearing without either of them naming it, and who had said, "I'll get it there, don't worry about it." Walter drove back to Kansas City the same night. He did not stay to celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. There was only a machine he needed to bring home to a piece of ground he did not yet have. The work was starting, not finishing. The Pelletier parcel came together in the spring of 1992. Gus Pelletier was 83 years old and had not farmed his 160 acres of Harlan County ground for 5 years. Not for lack of will, but for lack of someone he trusted to do it right. His own sons had left the county. The last tenant he'd had worked the ground hard and returned it poorly over-tilled, under-rotated, the kind of short-term extraction that leaves a landlord feeling like he's been used rather than partnered with. Walter had driven out to see him in February. He had not brought a business plan or a presentation. He had brought his service record, his VA disability documentation, and a hand-drawn diagram of the crop rotation he intended to use on the parcel 3 years of corn, soybean, wheat rotation with a cover crop interseeded in the wheat year to begin rebuilding organic matter in the ground's upper horizon. Gus Pelletier had looked at the rotation diagram for a long time. Then he had said, "My father used to rotate like that." Walter had said, "It's what this ground wants." The lease had been a handshake agreement for the first year, $45 per acre cash rent, payable at harvest. This was below the county average. Pelletier had set the number himself. When Walter offered to go higher, Pelletier had said, "Get through the first year, we'll see where we are." Walter had gotten through the first year. The 1992 crop season was the first time Walter Briggs had farmed ground of his own in the sense that he was responsible for it, answerable to it, the person whose decisions would determine what it did and what it gave back in more than 20 years. He planted corn on the south field in early May, running the Oliver at the pace the ground asked for, which was slower than he might have chosen if he had been in a hurry, which he was not. He had waited 23 years. He was not going to hurry the first season. The tremor in his hands was present every morning during that spring. It was worse in the cold and better by midday. He had learned, in the years since Korea and Vietnam, to work around it, to time his precise tasks for the warmest part of the day, to grip implements in ways that compensated for the shake. The Oliver's steering had enough play in it that the tremor did not translate through the wheel to the row. The old machine absorbed it the way a good horse absorbs a nervous rider, smoothing the signal before it reached the ground. He kept records. A spiral notebook, same as Raymond Cutler would do 3 years later, in a different state and for different reasons, though neither man would ever know the other existed. Date of field operations, soil conditions, equipment hours, observations. Walter's observations were practical and precise. The south field's northeast corner drains slow, work last. The headlands compact if turned on wet ground, add a day when in doubt. The Oliver runs cooler than spec at row crop throttle, check coolant monthly regardless. Gus Pelletier drove out to look at the corn in July. He walked the rows with Walter for an hour without saying much. At the south field's edge, he stopped and looked back across a stand of corn that was uniform and clean, and carrying exactly the color it should carry in that county in July. He said, "You know how to do this." Walter said, "I remembered." Pelletier nodded. The harvest that fall yielded 118 bushels per acre on the corn ground, 3 bushels per acre, above the county average in a year that had been dry in August. Walter wrote the number in his notebook, underlined it once, and went back to work. By 1994, the third year on the Pelletier parcel, the lease had been formalized in writing at Gus Pelletier's insistence, not Walter's. Pelletier had had his attorney draft a 5-year agreement with a renewal option at Walter's discretion. He had set the rent at $52 per acre, still below the county average, still a decision that belonged entirely to Pelletier, who said when Walter raised the subject, "The ground is being farmed right. That's what I wanted. We're square." Walter had begun, by then, attending the county extension meetings that he had not attended in any county in more than 2 decades. He sat near the back and listened more than he spoke. He was not a man who felt the need to be heard in a room. But he came, and over time, the agronomist who ran the Harlan County Extension Office, a younger man named Paul Schreiber, who had grown up in suburban Omaha and had come to this work through the university rather than through inheritance, noticed that the quiet man in the back asked the sharpest questions, and that when he occasionally offered an observation, it was the kind that came from someone who had been paying attention to something for a long time. Schreiber asked Walter once where he'd learned his agronomy. Walter said, "On the ground." Schreiber said, "Which university?" Walter said, "No university, just the ground." Schreiber understood this. Not everyone would have. The Clifford Anson debt, $1,100, borrowed without terms, was repaid in full in the fall of 1993. Walter had driven to Missouri with a cashier's check and a bottle of bourbon, both of which Clifford had been expecting in the sense that he had expected nothing, and both arrivals surprised him equally. They had sat on Clifford's back porch for 2 hours. They had talked about the Delta, and they had talked about corn prices, and they had not talked about the $1,100 or what it had meant or the phone call that preceded it. That was not what the afternoon was for. When Walter left, Clifford walked him to the truck and said, "You going to be all right up there?" Walter said. "I think so," Clifford said. "I know so." He said it with the confidence of a man who has had 50 years to understand what a person is made of when the information is available. Walter drove north. The harvest was 3 weeks out. He had work to do. Toby Neff, The dealer from Grand Island, who had bid against Walter at the Tuesday sale and stopped at $7,500, encountered Walter Briggs again in the spring of 1994 at a regional farm equipment show in Kearney, Nebraska. He recognized the Oliver 88 before he recognized the man. The tractor was on display. Walter had entered it in the working equipment category, not as a showpiece, but as a demonstration of what a 37-year-old machine looked like when it had been maintained properly and worked regularly and treated as a partner rather than a consumable. It was clean. It was mechanically sound. It ran. Neff stopped in front of it, looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the man standing beside it. He said, "I remember you from the Harlan County sale 3 years ago." Walter said, "I remember you too." Neff looked at the Oliver again. He said, "I had a buyer for that machine. Good customer." He paused. He said, "I lost him some money, letting it go." Walter said, "Did you?" Neff said, "I think I also lost him something else." He said it carefully, the way men say things they have been thinking about for longer than the conversation suggests. "I saw your hands shaking. I figured you were, He stopped. "I figured wrong. I should have asked what I was actually looking at before I decided I knew." Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Most people in that room had already decided. You just stop bidding. That's not the worst thing a man can do." They shook hands. Neff walked on. Walter watched him go and then turned back to the Oliver and checked a hydraulic fitting he had been meaning to look at since that morning, because the work was always the thing that needed doing, and the conversation was finished now. Carl Dempsey, the auctioneer, retired in 1999. He had called sales in Harlan County for 25 years. At his retirement gathering, a modest thing at the VFW Hall in Alma, he gave a short account of the sales that had stayed with him. He described the Tuesday in October of 1991 without using any names. He described a man with shaking hands who raised them in a room that laughed. He described what the room sounded like after. He said, "In 25 years on that floor, I called 17,412 lots. I remember about 40 of them, the way I remember that one. Because some bids aren't about the money. And when you're standing at the podium, you can feel the difference. You just have to be honest enough with yourself to call it the same way regardless." He said he hoped he had been. Walter Briggs farmed the Pelletier parcel for 11 years. When Gus Pelletier died in 2001 at 82, his estate offered Walter a right of first purchase on the 160 acres at a price Pelletier had specified in his will, $1,650 per acre, $264,000 total, with seller financing available over 15 years. The estate attorney had said, when Walter came in to discuss it, that Gus had told him 2 years before his death that the only thing he wanted to make sure of was that the ground went to someone who already knew what it needed. Walter bought it. He signed the papers in the same month of October that he had won the tractor a decade before. He did not consider this a coincidence. He considered it the natural logic of things done right. The Oliver 88 serial number, 88R41673, was still his primary row crop tractor when he leased the land to a neighboring operation in 2006 and stepped back from full-time farming at 66, his hands trembling more than they once had, but his mind as precise and observant as it had always been. He kept the tractor. It was not for sale. It had never been for sale. The man who had bought it at auction knew that from the day he signed the check. There is a version of the story of Walter Briggs that ends with the laugh in the sale barn, with the contempt of a room that looked at a disabled veteran and saw someone who did not belong. That version ends at the laugh because the laugh is the dramatic moment, and dramatic moments are easy to stop at. The real version keeps going. It goes through 37 years of corn and wheat and Nebraska October mornings on ground that a man came back to claim, not because the world owed it to him, but because he had decided in the pre-dawn dark of a sale barn equipment yard with his hand on a tractor's hood that he was not finished yet. The ground received him back. That is what good ground does, when the man who comes to it knows how to ask.